Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Larzalier family, we welcome you. We're so glad that you have joined us today as we honor the memory of Henry and Annabelle Larzalier with this annual lecture series. Henry and Annabelle were longtime members of the People's Church and the East Lansing community in which they were very active. I am Mary Ann Larzalier, and their son John and I were married nearly 60 years ago. We're so grateful to these dear ones for their kindness and their generosity and their inspiration. John and I would like to thank our planning committee, our very faithful planning committee of Penny and Mike Swartz, Sandy and Carol Bryson, and our pastors, Dr. Shawnthea Monroe and Reverend Haley Hansen, for all their help and their support of our Larzalier Lecture Series. We'd also like to thank Vince Watson and Zach Matthews for setting up lunch today in the Robertson Room while our social hall is under construction, and for taking care of the tech in this whole business. So didn't they do a great job? I don't think they can hear us, but let's tell them. Yeah. And now I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tim Docking, right here, who comes to us from Washington, D.C. Some of you may recognize that name of Docking. Tim's parents were Bob and Mill, and Bob served as the much-loved and respected superintendent of the East Lansing Public Schools in the 70s and early 80s. They were members of People's Church, so Tim grew up here. This is the first time we've ever had a speaker who was a hometown boy and came back to this church and had grown up here. He returns today to speak to us about his journey and the amazing work he is doing with refugees and displaced people around the world. Tim is the CEO and co-founder of the Refugee Investment Network, the first impact investing intermediary dedicated to creating long-term solutions to global forced migration. Recently, Tim has co-founded the Anti-Trafficking Investment Network, ATIN. Prior to the RIN, the Refugee Investment Network, Tim started his career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali, not Maui, Mali, big difference. Later on, Tim worked as a business executive for the IBM Corporation, where he managed business operations, technology, and emerging markets. Amongst his many accomplishments, Tim holds a PhD in comparative politics from Boston University. Tim's background in politics has influenced him to testify before Congress on African affairs, which formed and implemented policy at the highest levels of government. He has also commented extensively on impact investing, forced displacement, and violent conflict. Outside of his work, Tim and his wife, Julia, have 3 children and live near Washington, D.C. The title of Tim's talk today is Beyond Benevolence: Bridging the Christian Response to Forced Displacement with Market-Based Solutions. We're so glad he's here. I'm glad you're here too. So help me welcome Dr. Tim Docking. There you go.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. There we go.
Well, thank you. It's such an honor to be here and to come home to East Lansing. I've had so many nice asides with folks who either knew me way back when or knew my family, and it really warms my heart. So thank you for staying today, and I hope I teach you a few things about the work that we do and perhaps the wider world and the condition that we're currently in right now. As Mary Ann so kindly introduced me and generously, she mentioned that I was a Sunday school guy here. And this guy right here, chubby-cheeked boy with hair, believe it or not, is me. And this, some of you may know this guy here, or know of his family. His name is Brad Mills, and he's a kid that I grew up with. His mom was Sue Mills, and his dad was David Mills. He was a dentist. Sue was from the Beekman family, is from the Beekman family. But I just thought that was a cute picture. The only evidence, Marianne, that I went to Sunday school here, and for all you For all you Sunday school teachers out there, it's to show you that those ball jar ornaments that you make in craft class, they endure. They endure. That's still on our tree every year. Interestingly, Brad and I are still real close friends. He lives in Falls Church, Virginia, which is real close to where we live, and our families are buddies too. But I juxtapose that picture there with one that is quite different. This is always sort of a striking image, and for those of you in the back who may be squinting your eyes, I invite you forward. I have a number of slides, and there's writing on some of them, and I'm not going to read verbatim slides, but it may help you to come a little bit forward. But if you can't see, this is an image of thousands of Rohingya people who some of you may know lived and were based in the country Burma, that now is called Myanmar, and that administration has hunted and chased these people across the border into Bangladesh. And many of those people now are encamped in an area called Cox's Bazar. And it is quite a desperate existence for these people. But I thought this image sort of captures broadly a lot of the dynamics that are at play right now in the world. So many of you aren't familiar with the refugee issue, and if you didn't hear me speak a little bit earlier, currently in the world, there's about 125 million people who have been forcibly displaced. Some of the top refugee-producing countries I've listed here: Syria, 6 million people made refugee, and a refugee is someone who crosses an international border. But on top of that, there's 9 million more who are displaced internally within Syria. So that's about 15 million Syrians have been displaced. Venezuela, about 8 million people have left Venezuela. Ukraine, Afghanistan, all of these are countries where you're well aware there's been conflict. The civil war in Sudan, I think at this point, has probably produced more than 2.5 million refugees and a lot more people internally displaced. So you may see the number at the bottom aggregated here, where it says the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees estimates that there's 43 million refugees worldwide at the end of last year. And then here, there's 123 million forcibly displaced. And so we aggregate the internally displaced people and people that have been displaced outwardly, and that's a common practice in the humanitarian space, and one now being adopted by the High Commissioner for Refugees as well. So that gets us to the number that now is around 125 million people forcibly displaced. Our work addresses all of these folks. And so this slide says, Refugee Investment Network defines refugees broadly, inclusive of those forcibly displaced across borders and internally by violence, persecution, and natural disaster. I lay this out there because a lot of times migration or economic migrants are lumped into this world of refugees, and we draw a line on people who are economic migrants. Indeed, I would have been an economic migrant when I moved to Washington for my first job if we were defining things accordingly. But we talk about people who have been forcibly displaced, and many of the people that support our work and that we work with do as well. It's this broad definition. So that's sort of the conditions in the world, broadly. But what impact is this having? I've listed just a few headlines here, which again, some of you can't read, but I threw these up there because it suggests that the issue that we feel so acutely, I think, in the United States or maybe in nearby countries is really being experienced in a lot of places. And the effect is that it is really driving a rise of populism in many, many countries around the world. And I've just highlighted here in Turkey, in Iran, in the UK, in Sweden, in Italy, as you probably know, there's a real rise of populism and an anti-immigrant trend that's going on. It's not new. I think the foreigner has often been sort of an easy whipping boy for politicians, but it really is now. It's really driving change, and it is having major effects, as you probably know. The refugee crisis today also has a developmental effect. I don't know if folks have ever heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a set of 17 goals that was set out in 2015. It was a 15-year plan that the international development community got behind and set out to alleviate poverty, hunger, healthcare, quality education. There's 17 of them that have been laid out. They've been widely accepted, and refugees are they're never mentioned explicitly in the Human Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, but the refugees run horizontally through 13 of those 17 that are there. So all that is to say that this is a development issue as well. If we really are trying to address the sustainable development goals, we need to really think in terms of the displacement crisis as well. So it's a human crisis, it's a political crisis, it's a development crisis, and we come at this from the point of view that, and as I mentioned in my remarks in the service today, we really see this as the defining human crisis of our time. And it has been addressed in ways in which have been honorable and very well-intentioned, but the traditional humanitarian system and systems are really being overwhelmed. So what we have tried to point out is that refugees are often overlooked with untapped potential. And the way that we come into the discourse on this topic is we try to really, through data, through example, show the entrepreneurial nature of people that have been forcibly displaced. I love this quote here that I have from Nubar Afan, who is the prize winner here. He said, "Of course refugees are a good bet as entrepreneurs. When you've had the building next to you collapse, you don't really care about your first investor rejecting your investment pitch. You keep going." And I think we find this again and again. People are extremely gritty who have been through hard times. You've probably seen it in your own lives, but we find this sort of indelible attitude, and indeed the proof is often in the pudding. These three big corporations were set up by people who were refugees. And I always love to point out that half of the S&P 500 companies, have been set up by either migrants or people who have been forcibly displaced. It's an astounding statistic. People who are displaced are often really hard workers, really loyal employees. And we just use a little bit of data here to show, for example, here in the manufacturing sector here, the bar on the left side here, this 4% churn rate, turnover in the manufacturing sector, is juxtaposed with people who haven't been forcibly displaced, which is 11%. So what we find when we talk to employers and we talk to businesses is that they really like people who have been displaced. What we're doing here is making an economic argument for the inclusion of forcibly displaced people, and that includes credit and debt as well. I'll give an example later in the presentation of some friends of mine from Louisville, Kentucky. Their small-time investors bought a house, found that their best tenants of that house were always people who were refugees. And so they said, I think we've got a business model here. And they started renting to refugees, and they're so successful they now have, I don't know, the slides will show it, but I think they have 1,400 units now, and their fund and their properties just are for forcibly displaced people, new Americans. So I'll just give you the quick sort of provenance of the Refugee Investment Network, which, as Marianne mentioned, is RIN, the Refugee Investment Network. We're really trying to shift the paradigm, the humanitarian paradigm. We're really trying to, on the one hand, work with interested investors. I don't know if folks know what impact investors are. People who are looking for more than just capital return, but also want something good to occur because of their investment as well. You probably all have some money in maybe a 401k or something that might be involved in a green bond or another thematic investment field. We're working with folks who are interested from the faith-based community, from religious pension funds, from family offices, foundations, in trying to inculcate this idea of a refugee-supporting sort of investment on the one side. On the other side are those entrepreneurs I was just speaking about, and other refugee-supporting businesses, which I'll talk a little bit about. I'll pause in a minute here, but I just wanted to sort of lay the foundation here, and I'll give you some examples of our hypothesis at work. This is my one wonky slide, but if you bear with me, I think it sort of makes sense. It should make sense. Our theory of change is really to build those tools for those businesses, those investors who said, you don't need to explain to us why. Our heart is there. Our heart is with them. So we get the why. We know why we should care, but how do we engage? There's no tools. There's no definitional work. How do I go to investment committee? Or how do I talk with the people that are investing money in our fund to explain to them what's a refugee supporting business? And that's where we started. And so we set out to build the field of what we call refugee lens investing. And that's all these tools that really are tailored for businesses and investors who intend to be intentional about their work. From there, and that's mostly as field building, we mobilize capital by socializing these ideas, by working with the big players like the World Bank and the International Financial Corporation, the bilateral aid organizations that are our clients, like the Swiss government or the US government before these recent changes that we've worked with, who really have said, you're right, we need something different than the typical humanitarian model. We need something that will be self-sustaining, that draws the private sector in, brings the private sector to bear. So after the mobilization of capital, our third pillar of our work is supporting evidence-based policy change. And if anybody's interested in how we do that, I could tell you about our model there. And then it's changing that negative narrative that refugees are a burden on society. We don't want them. We really believe, and we show with evidence, that refugees present an opportunity, if given the opportunity to work. This is sort of the last, sort of classroom slide. But this is our lens. Probably some of you are thinking, what's a lens? It's a taxonomy. It's a six-part sort of lens is a common parlance in the investment community when you want to have some impact. And as I explain it to you, I think it's quite simple. We look at companies and we say, okay, these companies are refugee-owned by those entrepreneurs I was mentioning earlier. Companies can be refugee-led, where people who have been displaced are in the C-suite, are calling the shots, or being intentional about their support. Those are some of our smaller partners here. We do work in this space, but it's really this number 3 and number 4 where we see big companies. So these are really large, investable sorts of businesses that are refugee supporting. And that would be defined as a company that provides goods and services that support humanitarian efforts, or hires intentionally people who have been displaced and supports refugees. And then this one here is more aimed at host communities, because a lot of the communities that we work in, for example, in Uganda, for example, where there's over 1 million refugees, the Ugandans that they live next to live more or less at the same level that the displaced people do. And so if you go in and just help one population and not the other, you can cause more issues, cause more problems than you solve. So when you think about this sort of definition, again, what's a refugee investment? This is what we point back to. And this, sort of surprisingly to our team, has been the most used sort of tool that we've put out there. People have always said, well, what's a refugee investment? Boom, you have a 6-part taxonomy that people can go to and say, oh, this fits. Okay, it's a refugee investment. We can measure impact. We can build a pipeline of investments from that. This is number 5 and number 6 here. These are debt funds or loan funds that provide debt to these first 4 categories. And these are equity funds that would buy shares, for example, in an R3 company. So I have a little video that sort of illustrates, hopefully, what I said and stays pretty close to it, but I think it'll give you a better idea of how this works in practice. Allie?
Limiting human progress in health, climate change, poverty reduction.
Okay. Oops.
Forced migration is a massive challenge that intersects with almost every major development goal. Limiting human progress in health, climate change, poverty reduction, human dignity, and global security and stability. Over the past decade, the number of forcibly displaced people has more than doubled to over 100 million for the first time on record. While foreign assistance and humanitarian aid are vital in emergency contexts, neither are sustainable in the long term or capable of providing the scale of financing needed to solve this growing crisis. We believe that private sector solutions that invest in the potential of displaced people and the communities that host them will lead us towards a more inclusive future.
Refugees face a lot of challenges building their new lives in host countries, including restrictive economic policies, challenges integrating into new communities, and then also the high perceived risk from employers.
Wakati tulifika Uganda toka Kongo, tulikuwa tunataka kazi, but hawakutupatia hiyo opportunity ya kutumika nayo kwa sababu wanajua sisi tuko wakimbizi.
Livara started in 2013 with just 3 employees and selling our products online, and now we have 6 locations to which we have 4 huge salons attached, and we have over 64 employees. The decision to hire and train refugees has been a very good decision for Livara. Customers seek out the services of our skilled workforce. So you find that our salon is known to have the unique Congolese kind of styles. We wouldn't be where we are today without the help of the refugees.
The narrative around refugees is changing. Leading investors are starting to see the entrepreneurial power behind forcibly displaced populations, that they are resilient, resourceful, and great investment partners. Together with humanitarian groups, policymakers, and displaced people themselves, the Refugee Investment Network is working to bridge the gap between this growing field of investors and the largely untapped ecosystem of refugee entrepreneurs and ventures. But what is a refugee investment? RIN created the Refugee Lens to answer this question. The Refugee Lens is an investing framework to qualify and track refugee investments over time. The lens provides investors with a tool to intentionally assess and qualify prospective and past deals as Refugee Lens investments. There are 6 different categories that an enterprise can be classified within to be considered a Refugee Lens investment.
Currently, refugees make up 22% of our workforce, qualifying us as an R3 company. Within the next 5 years, we hope to open up to 50 salons through the franchising model. So working with refugees is important for our growth plan, and we shall continue investing in refugees. To others in the business community, I would say that the opportunity is there and the time is now to invest in refugees.
New narratives, inclusive economic policies, and bold partnerships are moving forward as the field of refugee lens investing grows. Ultimately, we believe that together with RIN's network of partners, we can achieve a world in which inclusive economies are celebrated locally and unlocked globally, driven by capital that promotes sustainable solutions to forced displacement and enables self-reliance for millions. Learn more at refugeeinvestments.org.
Okay. Let me pause there. I've been speaking a lot. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Okay. Yeah. Yes, yeah, sure. The nuts and bolts of a business we really leave to the business to handle those things. This story of Maxima's, and isn't she just a great spokesperson? We couldn't have found someone with a better smile and a better spokesperson. She did all of this like on one take too. She was a natural. She was so good. But Maxima started up the business, and we had introduced some investors to her business, and we knew that she was really, telegenic and articulate and full of life, and so she was the one who did this bit for us. But she managed those things. And if it didn't become clear, she's not a displaced person. She's a Ugandan who found this niche in the market in Uganda of Ugandan women who want their hair tressed in a certain way that Congolese women know how to do. So she hired all these Congolese people in and started a business. And so it was a neat story. But there's 100 of these sorts of stories, but that's the one I mentioned. I threw this picture up again just to remind you. A lot of times when we're talking about people who have been forcibly displaced, these are the sorts of images we see, right? We try to hew away from those. We really try to tell a positive story, a story of potential. And so we show images, and you'll see images if you ever look at our website like these or our reports. It's people at work. There are a lot of places where there's labor shortages in the world. We did a big chunk of work in the UK, the United Kingdom, and they are dying in certain areas of the UK for labor, and nobody is a bigger fan of ours than like the Chambers of Commerce, because their members really are looking for employees and such. And so, but these are this is the sort of imagery we sort of try to work with. Another tool that we have is we have a map. It's sort of indicative, but we've cataloged a few hundred refugee supporting businesses. And so there's a map on our website. I should back up and say as well, everything we do is open source. We're not a consulting firm like one might think. We very much are a systems change organization. Everything that we get, we just put out. And we're trying to shift that paradigm, the humanitarian paradigm. And we think that serves us, just like this. If people say, how would I ever find a business? We hope at one point this map will be filled with opportunities, but we don't quite have the resources to do that sort of level of work. I'm going to talk now about some of our work in different areas of the world. We've done a lot of work, as I've mentioned, in Africa, but that's not the only place that we've worked. And I just, again, to help you understand how we see the opportunities and the challenges in these areas, we catalog those, and we don't just, flip through the most recent report. We get out, we do field work, we get hired to come in and do market assessment work. So we look at the environment in the countries where we work. Every country is a little bit different. And across Eastern Africa and Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, down into Southern Africa and Zambia, we have done this sort of market assessment work, and we surface opportunities and challenges with our work. And these are data points that people that want to invest in those areas are looking for. We've done a lot of work in these countries, as I mentioned, and this, I'm not going to read this slide to you, but if you know that side of Africa, this is the Horn of Africa, and up in Ethiopia and down in Zambia, where we have continuing work down there. And there are very interesting opportunities there in various sectors. So we will highlight which sectors we see opportunities for labor or entrepreneurial areas. All 4 of these countries have very interesting refugee policies on paper, right? De jure, things look pretty good. But when our assessment people go in there and look at things, at the de facto realities, a lot of times we were able to highlight areas where their policies aren't, filtering down. And so we very much highlight those areas as well. Sometimes it's intentional, but it's not always intentional. As we know from our own experience, policy work is really complicated and hard, and sometimes you know when it's not working, and sometimes you don't. And so we try to highlight that too, all on behalf of forcibly displaced people. But we don't just work in emerging markets. We work in areas like I mentioned earlier, like the United Kingdom. We were asked by a family office. It's a rich individual. He was a South African guy who inherited the Safe Light Windshield Company. It's a South African business, and he's putting a lot of his money now to good deeds. And he funded a study that we did in the UK where we looked at trying to unlock refugee self-reliance there. Again, we focus on building the field, mobilizing capital through it, and then changing that narrative locally. And that led to a lot of engagements, including with the London Chamber of Commerce, who I mentioned earlier. We designed some questions, and they went out and they asked a lot of their businesses there. I think there was over 600 businesses that they polled. And they asked them questions like, does your business employ a refugee? I won't go through all the data points, but these data often don't exist, but they're very instructive and helpful for people who are interested in improving areas or taking advantage of other areas. I'm sure you can't read this, but I'll just point out some of the questions that were asked by this same study from the London Chamber of Commerce was what sectors do you have a skills gap? In the information and communications sector, 61% polled said that they have skills gaps there. In the public administration and defense, education, healthcare system, 76% of those businesses polled said that they had skills gaps. Well, juxtaposed, or on the other side of that, is the other question that accompanies that is how many refugees work in your organization? And they're all in the low single-digit percentiles. Again, data that we present to show policymakers and investors the opportunity as it's presented. This is the last slide, I think, on the UK study. What was promising, I think, without this study, was that this question was asked: how likely or unlikely would your organization be to hire refugees in the future? You can see here that micro organizations, I think we defined micro as under 100, was only 32% were likely to hire, where that number jumped up to 77%, and these are businesses of 500 or more people, were willing to hire refugees in the future. These are all signs of hope and signs of demand. So I'll skip this slide, but this is a slide of a business that was started by displaced people in the UK, entrepreneurs. These are kind of interesting. We do profiles of businesses as well. This is a business called Sahan Cares. And it was started up by some East Africans, Somalis. There's a big community there, and they saw a real gap in elder care. And it's an area where there's a gap all around the world. And they set up a very nice business called Sahan Cares, and they hire other people who have been displaced from that area, and business is booming. We've introduced a number of investors to them, and those investors are having an impact, on those communities, and they're also making a nice return on their investment. Another smaller business is this woman here, the Syrian lady, started a cheese company called Yorkshire Dama Cheese. That was a good story as well, where we were able to help her attract some business to her, some capital to her business. Now on to the U.S. So I talked about this earlier. This is one of my favorite examples. It's a real estate deal. It's a company called Launch Capital Partners. They're based in Louisville, Kentucky. Couple of guys, as they first started, as I mentioned earlier, they bought a house, and they're having some trouble with renters until they rented to some folks from Haiti. And they were really good tenants, and they were able to refinance the home and purchase another home, and they went through the same exercise again, and they rented to some people from Afghanistan. And they had a really good experience with them. They stuck with them. They started to put two and two together, and they said, these people who are coming in here in Louisville, new Americans, they come through the refugee agencies, so they've been checked out and everything, are really good renters. The other thing is that it's impossible in many situations for new people coming into our society to rent. They don't have a credit history. They don't have a lot of a deposit, a security deposit. They may not have references. And these guys said, we're willing to risk it because we see what good tenants they can be. So currently, I think this number's a little bit low, but they have over $100 million under management. They own over 1,500 units, and they have tenants from over 40 different countries. So they say their goal is to eliminate housing insecurity for refugee families. They work directly with the refugee agencies, the resettlement agencies, who are always looking for places for people to live when they come into the United States. And what that affords them is a really great opportunity to do wraparound services. Once you have someone living there, you can work with the children, you can work with resumes, you can work with employers and language training. And so they've engaged their church in many instances to come in and do some of these things, do some of the property management. It's just a really nice model. So their investment thesis, which is sort of fancy words in the investment community for the rationale, they say their investment thesis is that they take a contrarian view on tenant screening and views refugees as assets, not risks. That's how they play the game. And here's the number that I referred to earlier. 85% of landlords in America are unwilling to rent to refugees. Well, they try to fill that gap. They see it as an enormous opportunity, and they've proven that people who they rent to are really reliable. And these are just a few of the numbers, not to give you too much information, but their collection rate is 98%, where a normal collection rate drops down to all the way down to 94, 95% for people. Their vacancy rate is 1.7%, where vacancy rates for people who haven't been displaced, normal populations, varies from around 5%. And their turnover rate, again, is much lower. People tend to go there, stay there, like it there, and get those wraparound services as they sort of assimilate to their new society. So it's really been an interesting model that we've seen. I think I'm aware of 4 or 5 other real estate investment companies, and these guys are just private equity guys. They're not, they do this impact work, but they give a good rate of return, as you can see here. Their most recent fund is 6 to 8% interest rate is on a debt fund, but they did private equity funds that returned nearly 20% on some of their investments that they did earlier. So it can be a business. It can be a business model that's that's really productive. And these are the sorts of things we try to highlight. Oh, I thought this was, okay, this is another sort of interesting fund that we worked with. Some of you know the International Rescue Committee, IRC, but in one corner of the IRC, this group started called the Center for Economic Opportunity. I always like the CEO name, IRC CEO. And we partnered with them a couple years ago, and we helped introduce some of our investors to a debt fund that they had. And the debt fund in particular was for car loans. And just like people need a place to live in America, people really often need a car to drive in. And as this organization witnessed, people were facing usury interest rate charges who were coming into the United States. And so, again, you can't see this example, but they came in and intervened in a lot of situations where people were paying 28% on their car loans, and they could come in with a product for 9%. And with that 9% rate of return, they could create an evergreen fund. It was enough for them to take the initial sort of philanthropic money that they had and leverage that and keep it going and give out car loans. And so they created a product that was specifically aimed at Afghans as they came over around the 22-23 period, I think that was. And as you can see here, they dispersed almost $20 million, and the repayment rate on those loans was nearly 98%, which is about 4 percentage points above your average car loan rate. Again, building the case that people who have been displaced and are here are good debtors, etc. I thought you might be interested to know who some of those initial investors were in this fund here. And I don't know if any of those look familiar to you. It's a mix of faith-based organizations. Mercy Investment is the Mercy Sisters. I think they're based in Atlanta. The Mission Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It's a group of nuns or an order of nuns in Chicago, whose patron saint is the saint of refugees. They invested out of their pension fund into it. But at the same time, like the Shapiro Foundation, this is a gentleman called Ed Shapiro. He does a lot of work. He was a hedge fund guy, very wealthy guy, and his cause is displacement. And so he gave some money. And we introduced a number of these funders to CEO to fund that loan fund. And they weren't looking to make grants or do anything like that. They were looking for just concessional returns, moderate rates of return, which they indeed got back, and that was the initial fund for this. But these are just examples of some of the work that we support and we encourage, and this is just about it. This is just about my last slide here. But so shifting the paradigm. Are we shifting the paradigm? Are things changing? We've been doing this for 7 years. We founded RIN in 2018, really, and there was really nothing there. And as I mentioned, we put that refugee lens in place, and it sort of started to catch on, and we started to do some work. And today I can say that with the sort of the end of overseas development assistance, the axing of USAID, the axing of development assistance in other countries that were big donors in the past, like the UK, like France, like the Germans. It's not just here where we've reduced those, our commitments. It's a global phenomenon. And so it's really being reshaped. So I think it's a combination of some of the work that we've done and the reality that the number of people in the world who are forcibly displaced just continues to grow. It's just a lineup, right? And the constrained resources that these agencies that typically supported displaced people face today, that we're getting a lot of inbound. What did you say about the private sector engagement? How do you engage the private sector in a sustainable way in which it's not just corporate social responsibility or philanthropy, but they can come in, get some returns, have a nice impact? So we're seeing a lot more inbound, and that's really encouraging. And I just put up a few examples of where we're seeing these things. And in September, I was speaking with someone earlier. I was asked to be part of it wasn't a big conference, it was a small conference, but at the Rockefeller Conference Center in Italy. And the title of the conference was Building a Global Alliance for Private Sector Solutions in Forced Displacement Contexts. And what we did is we got together, and this was everyone from the head of the UNHCR's Filippo Grandi, to others from the World Bank and the IFC, to some of us private sector-oriented people getting together and say, okay, how are we going to move the needle on this? So this was a real encouragement for us because we started at this place 7 years ago. I guess we were sort of on the leading edge of this. Now I think there's some catching up, which is really encouraging, and I think it was illustrated a bit by this conference and these heads of people that were getting together. We're just about to publish this piece here, The State of Refugee Lens Investing, Tracking the Momentum in Models, and that'll be sort of a compilation. I think we're going to put it out next week with a newsletter or something. This piece of work here, Refugee and Lens Investing in Jordan, Mafraq, Jordan, which is right up on the Syrian border. This was a piece of work we did with the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank, so it's a private sector arm of the World Bank, and there's our little logo, and this is the Dutch who funded the study. And that's out online now. One of our supporters over time has been the Conrad Hilton Foundation, and they're speaking our language. On their page on refugees, you can see here, Refugee Lens Investing, a sustainable solution for a growing displacement crisis. So we're seeing some evidence. I'm encouraged to stick with it for a bit now that we're seeing things move on this. These are a few of the organizations I've mentioned earlier who have been our clients and partners in the past. We're currently working with the World Bank on a $20 million project in East Africa. We always work with the High Commissioner for Refugees, IFC we're working with as well in a number of countries, and so forth and so on. And then this is our last slide. What's next? As part of doing a lot of this work over time, it became very clear to me that there's a real crossover between people who have been displaced, lost those protections of state, people that are in desperation, and trafficking, human trafficking. And it's not talked about that much. It's sort of it's strange. It's sort of, there's almost like two ecosystems. There's a very, I think it's safe to say, a very faith-based dominated group of individuals doing great work and the anti-trafficking work. And this is labor trafficking and it's sex trafficking. And it's horrible and it's proliferating. And the refugee community as well. And I found some studies that suggest, again, it depends on where we're at, what country we're in, but we'll find countries where 30, 40, 50, 60% of the people, the trafficked people who are human slaves or sex trafficked, have been displaced before that. And there's not enough of an appreciation for that. And so I'd like to, our organization would like to, take some of the best practices and some of the lessons learned from the last 7 years working on this refugee issue and transfer that to the anti-trafficking movement. And I'll close with this. We're working with a group down in Dallas, a bunch of faith-based investors. They have a fund, and their fund is a venture capital fund that invests in technological solutions for anti-slavery. So they're helping to intervene where you find labor trafficking. They're helping to intervene where they see sex trafficking by tracking bad guys and using artificial intelligence. And they have a really nice portfolio of companies and a burgeoning business. So with these guys, they have the fund already set up, and we're helping them build a framework and the toolbox around that and helping socialize this movement as well. Again, it's bringing the private sector to bear on these grand challenges that our old sort of structures and systems weren't really built to defeat. So thanks for your time. I hope that's interesting to you, and I really appreciate you all coming today, and I take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Docking. So my job is to run around with a microphone so that people can hear any of the questions that you might want to ask.
Yeah, what happened in 2016 and 17 that led you to 2018 and starting all of this?
So as Marianne mentioned, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I left here, I went to Albion College, I left there, and I went to West Africa. And my eyes were sort of open so wide I could never close them, right? It was really stunning. I stayed on there for time, extra time, and I was a trainer over there, and I really was taken with the poverty at that moment, you know, and development. And I worked closely with organizations like AID and some other international organizations, and it always stuck with me, like, how do we encourage economic growth and wealth production and development? And so it's all a long way around to answer your question. This has always been sort of a bee in the back of my head. Went to graduate school, I studied it, and went into the private sector. Primarily is because I didn't know the private sector, but I knew there might be some answers in the private sector. I didn't know what working a P&L statement was until I spent time in a big corporation, and I didn't know the potential of a big corporation until I started working in it. So when I left, I was working at IBM Corporation. I came out of it with this idea, with an idea like, okay, how are we going to bring the private sector aboard here? Because these well-intended, organizations like USAID and all these others around the world they're great, but they're never going to get it done. You know, how I think we can attack this in a way that's different, original, and perhaps more impactful is using the private sector. So that's what happened there. So I left private sector and we started this up.
How has the Trump administration's policies and actions towards refugees and other immigrants affected what you do and what can be done?
Well, I'll speak to you in terms of some of the examples that I shared with all of you right now. That Launch Capital project has had to reassess their model because our doors are closed right now. There are not new Americans coming in. And so that population that they catered to is very much dried up. So it's affected us along those lines. I think the dramatic cuts to the international development assistance budgets has really, as I said earlier, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that overseas development assistance is over, at least as we know it. And it's not just the United States. We may have taken the lead in that place, in that space, but others have followed. And so it's a profound impact. And I think leaders like those that I met, I mentioned when I was in Italy a couple of weeks ago, their heads are spinning. But I think that the dust is settling a little bit. If you follow this space, you know thousands of people have lost their jobs. In the UN system, in USAID, I think 10,000 people lost their jobs in a weekend. But it's not, again, it's not just here, it's not just at the UN, it's in a number of different development agencies. So it's really a time of reckoning, it's a time of being creative, and we hope to step forward and try to popularize some of the ideas that we champion because we think they were never more needed than they are now.
Do you have any concerns, or how do you prevent kind of colonialism creeping into these model systems of investment? So I can see theoretically how this would all work, but I can also see the tendency maybe for some paternalistic investment strategies creeping in as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. We're very aware of that. We're also very aware that most people, minus some of these improvements in policy, in the investment framework, minus that, so many of these people are unemployed, so many of these people do not work in the formal market. and that makes abuse very ripe. So we're very cognizant of what you might call refugee washing, and so we very much measure that. So we have measurement tools to be very attuned to the point that you're making there. I have to say, though, it's not a hard sell. When we go into businesses, like I mentioned in the UK, like I mentioned in Uganda, one of the things that we do, one of the services we provide is technical assistance. Because again, you go to a business and they say, okay, we get the why, but how do we do it? We've never done it before. We don't even ask people if they've been displaced. Our HR people have no idea how to, find these people. We're not built for this. And so we give technical assistance, and we bring in a consultant, and we help businesses transition or open their eyes to. And it can be just to market to a group. I mean, these are large. We think of refugees sometimes living in camps. Most of the time, they're settlements. The camps that I've been to in Uganda, for example, are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. So they're villages. They're not tents. But they're still sort of referred to these ways. And they don't have people market to them. And it could be good business. And it could bring them into, sort of a business economy. But I think into a free market, more of a free market sort of setting. A lot of these camp settings as well, businesses hew away from because they're very distorted economies. A lot of dependencies are created in those environments, and so businesses don't like to go in there in the first instance. If people feel like they're going to be given something, why are they going to buy something that, And so there's these issues that businesses have to create when they work with refugees. The good thing, I guess, is that I think the figure is 70% of people who've been displaced don't live in camps. They're in peri-urban areas. They're outside of the camp area. And we try to target those folks with business too. I guess the point I was going to make, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but with the businesses that are saying, how do we do this? We offer technical assistance. When we did that project, we had 3 businesses that we could choose from. So we put out sort of a request for interest. We received 30 businesses, came back to us and said, we're interested, we would love to do this. And we could only choose 3 of them. So the unmet demand there was, 90% of the companies that said we want to do this, but we chose 3 and it worked out great. I'll just give you an example of one of them. One of them was this large ag industry company just north of Kampala that were farming soy. And they're just getting the mung beans. I really don't know what a mung bean is, but it's some different, and nor did the people around there, the farmers around there. We had worked in a camp north of there called Kiryandango, just adjacent to their property. And so we talked to the CEO of this big ag industry company, and we said, why don't you work in Kiryandango? I mean, there's a lot of people that need work there. And they're like, well, it's a refugee settlement. We don't go there. I said, why not? Is there any prohibition? Oh, no, there's not. And so through this consultancy process and the technical assistance, long story short, was 4,000 of the people in that area started farming and started doing paid labor for this company. It was so easy. I mean, it was just right there, but they hadn't thought to do that, and they hadn't been enabled or facilitated to do that sort of work. So that's a good illustration of sort of how we've engaged.
Hello. Oh, okay. I think I now understand your very long title of your seminar today, but I still need you to help connect the dots because the word Christian is in the title. So what can we as Christians or as a church do to help this idea along?
Well, thank you. Yeah, truth be told, I have not spoken with a faith-based community like I did today, and I really welcome that. So that question, this may be the first time I'm answering this question. I know that it's in our hearts as Christians to do these sorts of jobs, this sort of work. Actually, the anti-trafficking work, I'm doing a lot more work with faith-based organizations. And I think it's a great way to rally both arms and legs and great minds around something through our community. And I think it's a good way to corral some funding as well. I think there's a lot of Christians who want to do their investment, but they want to know that their investment is going towards the right things, Christian sorts of things, and hopefully you see that these are within our faith tradition as well, pursuing these goals.
Tim, to follow up on Paula's question to you, you've not cited how we can contribute, in other words, outreach, to a particular fund that would support your work. And if you show the map, for example, there are a number of projects in the Great Lakes region that could be contributed to as well. We don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And so that's my question.
Yeah, and we will help you do that. We'll help you make those connections. And that's part of the work that we do. I think, as I mentioned to Marianne and John last night, we're a small organization, and we very much are sort of a systems change, big picture sort of organization, and we don't do a lot of hand-holding of entrepreneurs, although we have in the past. We feel the scope and the scale of the problem is such that we're trying to do the systems change work so that everybody sort of turns in this direction. So that's where we spend most of our time, Sandy, is doing that work. But whatever we have up on our map, we can help you connect to. Or on stateside as well, there's some really good work being done with funds that could invest along these lines as well that I could talk to you later about.
I'm interested in the impact that this organization is having on human trafficking and the correlation between the cuts in aid to the increase in human trafficking.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to give you a satisfactory answer to that. We've been working on trafficking, anti-trafficking for a year. But this is a well-developed community, really doing excellent work. And I would say I'm on a monthly call, and I just had a call on Thursday. And earlier this week, there were 23 girls rescued in Oklahoma from people that's part of this community. And if you know how this community operates, a lot of the people involved in it are anonymous because they are disrupting gangs and their lives are under threat, literally in some ways. And so they're like people who come to the call who don't never put their camera on or never share their name, for example. It's pretty heavy stuff. But I know that because of the community, this community, that last week 23 sex slaves were rescued and taken into custody and taken into protective care and education and these things as well. The thing that I hear people who have been in the community longer than me, the anti-trafficking community, talk about is how the past however many years in the wave of people that came across our border, we really lost track of a lot of kids, and we really lost, in the gangs just jumped on these kids. And so it is a horrendous problem right now in the United States, but globally. And then when you factor in the internet and all the terrible things that happen there, it is really a tough issue. But this fund we're working with, they're trying to support companies and seed companies that have those technical solutions where they can figure out who these people are and get them, and identify where these kids are and save them. On the labor trafficking front, we participated in a project, so at the end of this year, beginning of this year, where we traced a rare earth mineral called tantalum, which is something that is in everyone's phone in this room. It's a high conductive metal, a little bit of it gets into all our phones. And this tantalum was being mined with child labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the group that we worked with, they tracked the supply chain of this mineral up to 105 S&P 500 companies that had a dirty supply chain that was using that mined tantalum with slave labor. And that's just a start. But what we would like to do is then to go to these, and we started to do this now, go to these companies and say, are you aware that you're sourcing this from slave labor, child labor. And so we're just getting started in that space too, but that's our aspiration, is to do things like that so that we can create change.
I had the privilege of having dinner with you and some others last night, and you were mentioning that you wanted to tap into one of the denominational huge retirement funds. And my understanding is that the question came up here at this church of where do we have our money invested, and are we unknowingly supporting with our money endeavors that we would normally, if we knew about them, we would not appreciate the ethics of that. So is it possible for even individual congregations, let alone the big, like Lutheran Pension Fund, to begin to question where our funds are invested and redirect our investments toward agencies, toward companies like yours, because your rate of return seems to be pretty high and pretty dependable. Can you illuminate on that?
Sure, thanks, Penny. I think what's critical in that analysis are data, and a lot of times the data are lacking. You know, you didn't know until I'm telling you right now that Apple sources tantalum from slave labor in the DRC. It's not a known fact. What's the other? Another big name that we track to as well does that. So you need those data to make these sorts of decisions. But you all remember the divestiture and apartheid as well, and probably People's Church divested from that. So many organizations did, and it was instrumental in, nudging the apartheid regime out of South Africa all those years ago. So there's evidence for those campaigns working, but I think to look at your own portfolio, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know which companies or funds are the honorable ones or aren't. We endeavor to just provide those data to, open eyes and put headlights on things so people can make conscious decisions.
I would say the United Methodists, as a denomination, have a very clear investment policy, and they have made great strides in pulling themselves out of things that they find morally objectionable. The United Church of Christ does too. It's complicated because many of you are benefiting from investment strategies that are across the board and unknown, and so you don't know where some of your money comes from or goes to.
So that's the divestiture point of view. Generally, our point of view from the Refugee Investment Network is the investiture point of view, if that makes sense. So the positive impact, not avoiding the negative impact. The positive impact is a little bit easier, especially with the tools that we've designed where we can show where certain businesses are intentional about their embrace of displaced people. We can help people be that. So it's a bit of a different strategy.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming. Tim Docking, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.